January 17, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The morning air hung thick with humidity and the metallic scent of blood-soaked earth. Beneath the canopy of shattered palm trees, a young Japanese soldier lay motionless in a foxhole, his Type 38 rifle clutched against his chest. His name was Private Takeshi Yamada, 22 years old, a rice farmer's son from Niigata Prefecture. For 6 days, he had eaten nothing but 3 grains of uncooked rice and the bitter flesh of tree bark. His uniform, once pressed and proud, now hung from a skeletal frame like funeral cloth. The jungle had become his tomb, and he had accepted this with the stoic resignation drilled into him since basic training. He had been taught that surrender was a disgrace worse than death itself, a stain upon his family, his ancestors, his emperor. Yet when the American Marines found him that morning, too weak to raise his weapon, too delirious to invoke the honor of seppuku, he did not die. Instead, he was lifted onto a stretcher, carried through the mud, and brought to something he could not have imagined in his wildest fevered dreams, a prisoner of war camp where the enemy did not execute him, did not torture him, but handed him a rectangular cardboard box stamped with English letters he could not read. Inside that box was more food than he had seen in 3 months of fighting. This moment, repeated across thousands of Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific War, would shatter not just bodies, but the very foundation of an ideology built on sacrifice, deprivation, and the mythic superiority of the Yamato spirit. The Second World War was not merely a conflict of armies and territories. It was a collision of worldviews, a cataclysmic meeting of civilizations that measured strength in fundamentally different currencies. For the Empire of Japan, power flowed from discipline, from the willingness to endure suffering, from the spiritual purity achieved through self-denial. The Japanese soldier was forged in the furnace of hardship. His rations were meager by design, a philosophy inherited from centuries of samurai tradition, where the warrior's strength came not from his stomach, but from his spirit. In the Imperial Japanese Army, a soldier's daily ration might consist of a few cups of rice, perhaps a small tin of canned fish, occasionally some pickled vegetables. Meat was a luxury reserved for officers. Fresh fruit was unheard of. The average Japanese infantryman in the Pacific subsisted on roughly 1,200 calories per day, sometimes less when supply lines faltered. This was not seen as a failure of logistics, but as a test of character. Hunger sharpened the warrior. Deprivation purified the soul. Or, so they were told, across the Pacific, the United States military operated under an entirely different philosophy. The American soldier was not expected to transcend his physical needs, but to have them met, exceeded, celebrated. The U.S. War Department understood something the Imperial Command either could not or would not grasp, that morale, fighting effectiveness, and loyalty were not product of suffering but of abundance. An American serviceman in the Pacific Theater received approximately 4,000 calories per day, nearly 4 times a ration of his Japanese counterpart. But it was not merely the quantity that mattered. It was the quality, the variety, the almost absurd extravagance of choice. The C ration, the K ration, and later the 10-in-1 ration were not just food packages. They were edible propaganda, physical manifestations of American industrial might and democratic prosperity. Each box was a sermon delivered in tin and cardboard, proclaiming a simple message. This is what freedom tastes like. The Japanese High Command had prepared their soldiers for battle with speeches about honor and death. They had indoctrinated them with the Senjinken, the military code issued in 1941 by War Minister Hideki Tojo, which explicitly forbade surrender under any circumstances. To be captured was to cease being Japanese, to become a non-person, erased from family records, mourned as if dead. Japanese officers told their men that Americans tortured prisoners, that they would be castrated, mutilated, used for medical experiments. These were not merely scare tactics, but genuine beliefs, projections of Japanese military conduct onto the enemy. After all, the Imperial Army had committed such atrocities throughout China and Southeast Asia. Why would the Americans be any different? So when Japanese soldiers found themselves wounded, surrounded, starving, many chose death. They detonated grenades against their own bodies. They charged machine gun nests with bayonets drawn, seeking the clean death of combat rather than the imagined horrors of captivity. In the early years of the Pacific War, the American military captured almost no Japanese prisoners, not because they refused to take them, but because Japanese soldiers refused to be taken. But human beings can only endure so much. Ideology is a powerful anesthetic, but it cannot indefinitely suppress the body's screaming need for food, water, rest. By mid-1943, as the tide of war turned and Japanese supply lines crumbled, as island garrisons were cut off and left to starve, something began to change. The soldiers who had been promised swift victory found themselves trapped in prolonged sieges. The rice stopped coming. The ammunition ran out. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi ravaged units faster than American bullets. On Guadalcanal, on New Guinea, on dozens of nameless atolls, Japanese soldiers resorted to eating grass, insects, the leather of their boots, even the flesh of their dead comrades. In this extremity, the mathematics of survival began to override the calculus of honor. A few soldiers, weak beyond capacity for suicide, delirious with fever and starvation, were captured alive, and what they discovered in American captivity was so contrary to everything they had been told, so fundamentally incompatible with their understanding of war and the enemy, that it initiated a psychological earthquake. The first thing that shocked Japanese prisoners was that they were not killed. The second thing was that they were not tortured. But the third thing, the thing that many veterans would remember for the rest of their lives, with a mixture of shame and wonder, was the food. Private Yamada, after being processed at the field hospital on Guadalcanal, was taken to a POW compound on a Fata island in the New Hebrides. He had expected a cage, starvation, beatings. Instead, he was given a cot, a blanket, and 3 meals a day. His first American meal consisted of C rations, a can of pork and beans, a can of hash, hardtack biscuits, instant coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and toilet paper. The toilet paper alone astonished him. In the Japanese army, soldiers used leaves or simply went without. But it was the food that broke something inside him. He sat on the ground outside the Quonset hut, opened a can of pork and beans with the Lil P 38 can opener attached to the ration, and stared at the contents. There were chunks of actual meat, fat and glistening, suspended in a thick sauce. There were beans, more beans than he had seen in a single meal in 2 years of military service. He ate slowly at first, expecting it to be a trick, a final meal before execution. But no execution came. Instead, an American guard walked by and tossed him another ration. "You want second, buddy?" The guard said in English Yamada could not understand. But the gesture was clear. There was more. There was always more. This abundance was not accidental. The United States military had industrialized nutrition with the same efficiency it applied to aircraft production and naval construction. The Quartermaster Corps employed nutritionists, food scientists, and even psychologists to design rations that were not merely sustaining but morale-boosting. The C ration, introduced in 1938 and continually refined throughout the war, came in 3 varieties: meat and beans, meat and vegetable hash, and meat and vegetable stew. Each meal unit included accessory packets with cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, toilet paper, and water purification tablets. The K ration, designed for paratroopers and mobile units, was even more sophisticated: breakfast, dinner, and supper units, each containing not just food, but comfort items: bouillon cubes, lemon powder, Charms candy, a wooden spoon. By 1943, the U.S. military was packaging entire dining experiences into boxes that could be dropped from planes or shipped across oceans, each one a tiny ambassador of American abundance. Japanese prisoners initially refused these rations. Some believed they were poisoned. Others felt that accepting enemy food was a final betrayal of their oath to the emperor. But hunger is a relentless master, and gradually, reluctantly, they ate, and then they ate again, and then they began to wait for meal times with an anticipation that filled them with shame. In POW camps across the Pacific, on New Caledonia, Leyte, Okinawa, and eventually in the continental United States, Japanese prisoners encountered an enemy who seemed determined to demonstrate superiority not through cruelty but through excess. American guards ate the same rations, sometimes sharing their personal packages from home. Cookies baked by mothers in Ohio, salami from Italian delis in Brooklyn, bourbon smuggled in canteens. The prisoners watched American soldiers discard half-eaten cans of food, throw away cigarettes after a few puffs, complain about the monotony of the menu. This casual wastefulness was perhaps more demoralizing than any propaganda film. It suggested a civilization so wealthy, so productive, that it could afford to be careless with its abundance. What did you think would go through the mind of a soldier raised on tales of samurai frugality when faced with American plenty? Comment your thoughts below, because understanding the psychological shift helps us grasp why the war ended not just with military defeat, but with ideological collapse. The psychological impact of this food disparity extended far beyond individual soldiers. The U.S. military, recognizing the propaganda value of humane treatment, documented prisoner responses meticulously. Intelligence officers noted that Japanese POWs, once they overcame their initial terror of capture, became extraordinarily cooperative. They provided military intelligence, drew maps of defensive positions, even participated in American propaganda broadcasts urging their compatriots to surrender. This cooperation was partly pragmatic. They had already violated the Senjinkan by being captured alive, so there was no honor left to preserve. But it was also a response to the cognitive dissonance created by American treatment. These prisoners had been told that Americans were barbaric devils, racially inferior mongrels whose society was decadent and weak. Yet here they were, being fed better as prisoners than they had been fed as soldiers in their own army. The disconnect was impossible to ignore. In 1944, the U.S. Office of War Information established a special POW camp at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, specifically designed for intensive interrogation and re-education of Japanese prisoners. The camp's commander, Colonel Harold Deutsch, implemented a strategy he called killing with kindness. Prisoners were given 3 substantial meals daily, access to recreational facilities, education materials, and even movies. They were paid for work details at the same rate as American soldiers performing similar tasks. They could purchase additional items from a camp canteen, candy, tobacco, toiletries. Some prisoners gained 20 or 30 pounds within a few months of capture. In letters home, which were censored but preserved in military archives, several prisoners expressed confusion and guilt over their improved physical condition. One sergeant wrote to his wife, in a letter that would never reach her, "I am ashamed to say that I am healthier now as a prisoner than I was as a soldier of the Emperor." What does this mean? Were we fighting for something that was already lost? The symbolic power of food extended beyond calories and nutrition. In Japanese military culture, communal deprivation was a bonding mechanism. Officers and enlisted men ate the same meager rations, shared the same hardships. This equality in suffering was meant to forge unity. But American abundance revealed a different kind of equality. Not the equality of shared misery, but the equality of shared prosperity. Even the lowest-ranking American private had access to resources that Japanese officers could only dream of. POW guards, many of them farm boys from the Midwest or working-class kids from industrial cities, casually displayed a standard of living that exceeded that of the Japanese middle class. Their uniforms were well-made, their boots sturdy. They received mail from home regularly, packages filled with luxury items. They spoke to their officers with a casualness that would have been unthinkable in the rigidly hierarchical Japanese military. They debated politics, criticized their commanders, joked about President Roosevelt. This informal democracy of daily life was as much a part of American soft power as the rations themselves. By 1945, as the war ground toward its terrible climax, the contrast between Japanese and American logistics had become stark to the point of absurdity. On Okinawa, during the last major battle of the Pacific War, Japanese defenders resorted to eating snails, seaweed, and the roots of plants. American forces, meanwhile, were being supplied by the most efficient logistics network in military history. Ships arrived daily with fresh water, ammunition, and food. Mobile kitchens served hot meals on the front lines. Ice cream barges, floating factories that produced frozen desserts, anchored off the coast to provide treats for weary Marines. The U.S. Navy had ice cream barges. Let that sink in. While Japanese soldiers starved in caves, eating dirt to fill their stomachs, American sailors were debating whether they preferred chocolate or vanilla. This was not a war between equals. This was a war between an empire that had overextended itself beyond its capacity to sustain and a continental power with industrial resources so vast they seemed almost supernatural. The end of the war brought a final, crushing demonstration of American abundance. In August 1945, after the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese citizens heard for the first time. The war was over. The divine mission had failed. American occupation forces arrived in a Japan that was starving. Years of strategic bombing had destroyed cities, factories, and transportation infrastructure. The distribution system for food had collapsed. In the winter of 1945 to 46, the average caloric intake for a Japanese civilian in Tokyo was under 1,500 calories per day, below the level needed to sustain life over the long term. People ate grass, sawdust mixed with flour, acorns boiled to remove the tannins. Meanwhile, American occupation forces set up bases across the country and began the largest humanitarian feeding operation in history. The U.S. military distributed surplus rations to the Japanese population, opened soup kitchens, and eventually shipped thousands of tons of wheat, powder, milk, and canned goods as part of the Garrioa program, government aid and relief in occupied areas. Japanese citizens, many of whom had been indoctrinated to hate and fear the Americans, found themselves lined up at distribution centers to receive food from the enemy. Children who had been taught in school that Americans were demons now received chocolate bars from GIs who pinched their cheeks and practiced broken Japanese. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. The emperor had called for endurance, for sacrifice unto death, but death had been postponed by American generosity. The enemy who was supposed to annihilate the Japanese race was instead feeding it. This act of mercy, whether motivated by genuine humanitarianism or cold strategic calculation to prevent communism from taking root in a starving population, accomplished what all the propaganda broadcasts could not. It demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, that the American model, with its emphasis on abundance, its industrial capacity, its different understanding of power, had not merely defeated the Japanese military, but had rendered the entire Japanese wartime ideology obsolete. Veterans on both sides would spend decades trying to process what the war had meant. For many Japanese ex-soldiers, the memory of American rations became a shameful touchstone, a moment of weakness they could never quite forget or forgive in themselves. In memoirs and interviews conducted in the 1970s and 1980s, former POWs often spoke about food with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. They had been saved by enemy generosity, which meant they owed their lives to the very people they had been taught to despise. This debt was impossible to repay and difficult to acknowledge. Some veterans refused to speak about their POW experiences at all, maintaining the fiction that they had died in battle rather than admit to the dishonor of capture. But others, particularly in their final years, began to speak more openly. They described the surreal experience of eating canned peaches in a prison camp, while their comrades starved on bypassed islands. They talked about the cognitive dissonance of receiving better medical care as prisoners than they had as soldiers. They struggled to reconcile the propaganda image of the brutal American with the reality of the bored corporal who shared his cigarettes and showed them pictures of his girlfriend back in Nebraska. For American veterans, the memory was less complicated but no less poignant. They had expected a fanatical enemy who would fight to the death, and in combat, they often got exactly that. But in the prison camps, they encountered frightened young men who wept when given a full meal, who could not believe they were being allowed to live. Some American guards developed a reluctant sympathy for their prisoners, recognizing in their gauntness and desperation the common humanity that war tried so hard to obscure. These guards would later struggle to reconcile their compassion with the knowledge of what the Japanese military had done in China, the Philippines, and the Allied POWs. The calculus of mercy is never simple in wartime, but the decision to feed prisoners well, to treat them according to the Geneva Conventions, even when the enemy did not reciprocate, reflected a strategic understanding that power could be expressed through generosity as effectively as through violence. The symbolic object that recurs throughout these stories is not a weapon or a flag, but a simple cardboard box stamped with black ink, the American field ration. In the hands of a starving Japanese soldier, that box became a Rosetta Stone, translating the abstract concept of American power into something tangible, edible, undeniable. It was a sermon about industrial capacity, about a society that could afford to package luxury into disposable containers and distribute them across the world. It was a promise that the American way of war was supported by an economy so robust that it could feed both its own soldiers and its enemies' soldiers without strain. That box, with its tin cans and wax paper and cigarettes and candy, represented everything the Japanese Empire was not: wasteful, abundant, confident to the point of arrogance. And in the end, that confidence was justified. The boxes kept coming. They came to Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, to POW camps in Hawaii and California, and finally to the streets of Tokyo and Osaka, where children clutched them like treasure and adults tried not to weep at the charity of the conqueror. The story of Japanese POWs and American rations is not merely a footnote in military logistics. It is a parable about the nature of power in the modern world. The Japanese Empire believed that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that willpower and discipline could substitute for industrial capacity, that suffering ennobled the warrior. This was a beautiful lie, and millions died for it. The United States, for all its own contradictions and hypocrisies, understood that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, farms, and supply depots. American power rested not on the willingness of its soldiers to die, but on the ability of its economy to keep them alive, fed, and equipped. This was a less romantic vision of warfare, but it was vastly more effective. The soldier who is well-fed fights harder, shoots straighter, maintains morale longer than the soldier who is starving. This is not a profound insight. It is common sense. But common sense is often the first casualty of ideology. In the decades after the war, Japan and the United States would forge one of the most important alliances of the late 20th century. The former enemy became a trusted partner, and much of the Japanese economic miracle was built with American aid, technology, and markets. But the transformation began not in boardrooms or treaty negotiations, but in those early encounters between prisoners and captors, when ideology met reality and reality won. The young soldiers who ate American rations in POW camps went home to a defeated nation and helped build a new Japan, one that largely abandoned militarism in favor of economic development. Some of them surely remembered those cardboard boxes, the impossible abundance they contained, and decided that prosperity was a worthier goal than glory. They had tasted the future, and it came in a can. What does this story tell us about the nature of freedom and democracy? Perhaps this: that systems which prioritize human welfare over abstract ideals, which measure success in living standards rather than heroic sacrifices, are not just morally superior but strategically more resilient. The American ration was not merely food. It was an argument, delivered in the most persuasive language possible, the language of the full stomach and the satisfied body. It said that life is better than death, that prosperity is better than poverty, that a society which can afford to be generous is stronger than a society which demands constant sacrifice. This argument was made millions of times over in thousands of POW camps and occupation zones, and it was remarkably effective. It helped win the peace in a way that military victory alone could not. We should be careful not to romanticize this story. American abundance was built on its own forms of exploitation and inequality. The wealth that produced those rations came from a continental empire, from immigrant labor, from an economic system that had its own victims. The generosity shown to Japanese POWs was not extended equally to all. African American soldiers who fought in the same war came home to segregation and discrimination. The America that fed its enemies was also the America of internment camps for Japanese Americans, of atomic bombs dropped on cities. Moral clarity is always partial, always complicated by context and contradiction. But within the specific frame of the story, the encounter between captors and captives, between two military systems and their underlying philosophies, the contrast is stark and instructive. The war ended 79 years ago, but its lessons about power, ideology, and human nature remain relevant. We live in a world where soft power often matters more than hard power, where economic influence shapes geopolitics as much as military force, where the ability to project prosperity and opportunity can be more strategically valuable than the ability to project violence. The American field ration, in this sense, was an early example of soft power in action. It communicated more effectively than any propaganda broadcast could that the American system, for all its flaws, had something valuable to offer, not just to its citizens but to its enemies. It suggested that the fruits of democracy and industrial capitalism were worth more than the promises of martial glory and spiritual purity. In the end, the story of Japanese POWs surprised by American food rations is a story about the gap between what we are told and what we experience, between ideology and reality, between the world as we imagine it and the world as it actually is. Those young Japanese soldiers have been raised on myths of invincibility and the virtue of suffering. They have been promised a swift victory and a glorious death. Instead, they got a long defeat and a humiliating survival. But they also got something else, a glimpse of an alternative way of organizing society, one that valued abundance over scarcity, life over death, the practical over the ideal. Some rejected this glimpse and clung to their old beliefs, but others absorbed it, carried it home, and helped build a new Japan that chose prosperity over empire. The cardboard boxes that once seemed so shameful became, in retrospect, the seeds of a different future. This is what freedom tasted like in 1943. Like pork and beans from a tin can, like powdered coffee and hard biscuits, like chocolate that melted in the Pacific heat. It tasted like excess and waste and casual generosity. It tasted like the future. And for the young men who had been starving in the jungle, who had accepted death as inevitable and surrender as impossible, that taste was revolutionary. It broke something in them. The certainty that suffering was noble, that their leaders had been right, that the cause was worth the cost. And in breaking them, it opened a space for something new to grow. Not all transformations are violent. Sometimes, change comes quietly, delivered in a cardboard box by an enemy who refuses to play his assigned role. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not a bomb or a bullet, but a can of food, offered without ceremony, accepted with confusion, and remembered for a lifetime as a moment when everything they had believed turned out to be a lie. The Guadalcanal jungle where Private Yamato was captured is silent now, reclaimed by vegetation, visited occasionally by tourists and historians. The POW camps have been torn down, the records archived in climate-controlled vaults. The veterans on both sides are nearly all gone now, taking their memories with them into the dark. But the story remains, preserved in letters and interviews and military records, a testament to the strange alchemy of war that transforms enemies into teachers, defeats into lessons, and cardboard boxes into symbols of a larger truth. That truth is simple but profound. That the system which nurtures life will always, in the long run, defeat the system which glorifies death. That abundance is more powerful than austerity. That the future belongs not to those who are willing to sacrifice everything, but to those who build a world where such sacrifices are unnecessary. In the calculus of history, the American field ration was a footnote, a minor detail in the vast machinery of war. But in the calculus of individual lives, in the memories of the soldiers who ate them and the civilization they represented, those boxes were everything. They were proof that the enemy was not what they had been told. They were evidence that another way of living was possible. They were, in their own modest way, a feast in a box, a revelation of what power really means in the modern age.